is borrowed from Buddhism. Right. As with Krishna, she lists 18 similarities between Jesus shares with Buddha in the Christ conspiracy. Regarding these, I emailed, again, he emails an expert, Professor Chun Fong Yu. I had a brother named Chung Fong Yu. No, just kidding, sorry. Professor Chung Fong Yu, chairman of the Department of Religion at Rutgers. Dr. Yu has specialized in Buddhist studies. I listed the 18 similarities recorded by Miss Murdoch and asked if these were actually traditions of Buddha. Now this guy is going to the fountainheads of information on paganism, okay? These guys own this stuff. So, what was Dr. Fu Yu's what was Dr. Yu's response? Okay? She replied, quote, "None of the 18 similarities are correct. None! None! A few, however, have some semblance of correctness, but they are badly distorted." End of quote. Dr. Yu ended by writing, "This woman you speak of, this Miss Murdoch, is totally ignorant of Buddhism. It is very dangerous to spread misinformation like this. You should not honor Miss Murdoch by engaging even in a discussion with her. Please ask her to take a basic course in world religion or Buddhism before uttering another word about things she does not know." End of quote. Oh boy, this Zeitgeist movie's just, it's all over it. So accurate. This is the second time Miss Murdoch has been asked to take a basic 101 course in religion. She gets everything wrong. It is appropriate to mention here that Miss Murdoch's claim have to be mastered several... It is appropriate here to mention that Miss Murdoch claims to have mastered several religions. Oh yeah, she's real master. Legend in her own mind. Her book, The Christ Conspiracy, claims a mastery of Christianity. Oh, we've seen her, she quoting that psalm that didn't even exist. That was a good one. Her mastery of Christianity and her new book, The Sons of God, Krishna, Buddha, and Christ Unveiled, with excerpts found on her website, also indicate that she believes Hinduism and Buddhism to be two other religions which she mastered in terms of her knowledge of them. I think that would be contrary to these Hindu and Buddhist scholars that just respond to her. However, as we have seen, she is terribly ignorant of the actual most elementary traditions of Hinduism and Buddhism. As we are about to see, she is likely mistaken when it comes to her understanding of Christianity. Okay, so what does she say about Christianity? As we saw in section 1, astrology, that Miss Murdoch does not use biblical texts in an accurate manner to support her views. In this section, we will notice that she also possesses some peculiar views when it comes to the New Testament higher criticism. Can these views be supported? Well, she makes this case that the very late datings of the Gospels. Miss Murdoch holds that the Gospels were not penned until after 150 A.D., a view held by no major New Testament scholar, irrespective of their theological perspective. She supports her position by quoting John Reimsberger, who wrote, quote, "The four Gospels were unknown to the early Christian fathers. Justin Martyr, the most eminent of all early church fathers, wrote about the middle of the 2nd century. His writings in proof of the divinity of Christ demanded the use of these Gospels. Had they existed in his time, he makes more than 300 quotations from the books of the Old Testament and nearly 100 from the apocryphal books of the New Testament, but none of the other four Gospels." Now this is what she's using to back up what she's saying. But this is false. In Justin's first apology, Justin Martyr, called The First Defense, he writes, "For the apostles in their memoirs composed by them, which are called Gospels, have thus delivered unto us what was enjoined unto them, that Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, said, 'Do this in remembrance of me, this is my body,' and that, after the same manner, having taken the cup and given thanks, he said, 'This is my blood,' and gave it to them alone." So Justin calls the Gospels the memoirs of the apostles, and then quotes from them. But this guy said he would never ever did that. Well, he's a liar. In his dialogue with Typho, Justin makes mention of the memoirs another 13 times. In every instance, he either quotes from a gospel or relates a story from them. Why is it that Justin does not cite the Gospels when defending the deity of Christ? He is dialoguing with a Jew and wants to use the Old Testament scriptures to defend his position, since he shares these in common with Typho. This is also the practice of Paul. Now, and this is a Bible verse, now when they had traveled through Amphipolis and Apollonia, then they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews, and according to Paul's custom, he went to them for 3 Sabbaths, reasoned with them from the Scriptures. He was reasoning with the Jews with Old Testament Scriptures in order to validate and prove that Jesus was the fulfillment of the Messiah the Old Testament clearly predicted. Okay? As further support, she cites Charles Waite. At the very threshold of the subject, we are met by the fact that nowhere in all the writings of Justin does he once so much mention any of these Gospels. Now, this is her supposedly how she's justifying this. Nor does he mention either of their supposed authors, except for John. It is true that Justin never says who wrote them. However, contrary to Murdoch's sources, we know that they existed because Justin referred to them and quoted them just as we demonstrated above. Miss Murdoch could claim that the Gospels Justin referred to were different than the 4 we have, but if this is the case, what data can she provide to support her view? She must also adequately explain why there's a complete absence of manuscripts for these supposed Gospels that, she says were different. She must also explain why there's a complete absence of manuscripts for these, while we have an abundant number of manuscripts for the 4 Gospels that we now have. Moreover, the Gospels Justin appeals to seemingly have precisely the same content as the 4 we have now. So, she will have difficulty demonstrating that multiple layers of legend were added from Justin's time until the later part of the 2nd century, since the early sources which Justin was familiar with and from which the 4 Gospels supposedly borrowed said precisely the same things. So she goes further and she says, she writes that she says this guy named Waite, Charles Waite, says, no one of the 4 Gospels is mentioned in any other part of the New Testament. End of quote. So, he goes on to say that there is no other evidence of a gospel until the later part of the 2nd century. But this is false as well. Paul appears to quote from Luke's gospel in 1 Timothy 4:18, Luke 10:7. The oldest manuscript we have is a fragment from the Gospel of John, which dates to around AD 125, which is called P52. It's kept at John Reinhardt's library in Manchester, England. The early church father, Ignatius, AD 110, who either knew the apostles or was close to those who did, seems very familiar with the Gospel of Matthew because of the numerous parallels and apparent quotations from Matthew. Clement and Polycarp, who also knew the apostles, also make the use of Matthew. Second Clement employs numerous sayings from Matthew, Luke, and a few from Mark. All of these early Christian writers were from the later part of the 1st century, though no later than the middle part of the 2nd century. Therefore, her claim that the Gospels were not composed until the later part of the 2nd century is without support. And there is no respected New Testament critical scholars who embrace her datings. Murdoch quotes from the Woman's Encyclopedia of Myths and Secrets. Well, that sounds like a pretty accurate thing there. Sounds like a solid source to me. So Murdoch quotes from this Woman's Encyclopedia of Myths and Secrets, quote, no extant manuscript can be dated earlier than the 4th century. All right. This shows no knowledge of the manuscripts we have. The P52 papyrus mentioned a moment ago dates back to around 125. The P75 dates back to 175 to 225. The P46 and P66 are slightly earlier and both date to around 200. The P45, the first of the Chester Beatty biblical papyri, dates to the first half of the 3rd century. The P47 dates to the later part of the 3rd century. P72 dates to around the 3rd century. In summary, we have 7 manuscripts which predate the 4th century. Oh, but that's contrary to the Woman's Encyclopedia of Myths and Secrets. So I guess, you're just going to have to make up your mind on that one. Also, another point to bring up. The manuscripts that were the most true and the most used were also the ones that were, again, the most used. And these manuscripts wore out the quickest because they were used. The Catholic Church will say, well, we have the Vaticanus and the Sinaiticus, and they're the oldest manuscripts. The reason they were the oldest manuscripts is because people even in the Roman Catholic Church at the time when they were put out knew that they were heresy and junk and didn't even mess with them. Until later, Westcott and Hort came along, 2 basic occultists, and came and said, hey, we're going to translate these into the Bible. which ultimately turned into the revised version of 1881, which ultimately spawned